Okay, I think it's 10:15, so we're going to get started. I appreciate all of you coming out on an early Thursday morning. I'm sure there were many parties last night that could have prevented you from coming. So I'm Johnny Ford, and I'm a program manager on the VMM team. And I'm going to talk to you today about creating UI add-ins for VMM. So I want for you to think today about a troubleshooting experience for yourself or for a VMM admin. It's probably a pretty painful one, right? So you may start in one screen and look up something, and you may take that data that you looked up there and look in another screen, sort of carrying some of that context over. You may even go into some different tool and look up some additional things. And then finally, you may go into the VMM console and actually do something that fixes it. But you're probably not in the VMM console the whole time while you're doing troubleshooting. So in SP1, there's a feature called add-ins that gives the option for having a ribbon button that could bring all of this information together in the VMM console in one place. And I'm going to talk to you about that today. And at the end, you'll know how to create one, what they are, and we'll have gone through both a simple and a complex example. So we'll talk about what add-ins are, the different types, how to create them, and I'll show you a couple of demos as well. So what is an add-in? An add-in is quite simply a way to extend the VMM console. This is new in SP1. It didn't exist in 2012. And with add-ins, you can add buttons to the ribbon. You can add options to right-click menus. And you can create views for the right side of the console. And I'll show examples of all of these as we go through. So there are several about 4 common uses for these. One is troubleshooting, which is the example that I started off with, where you want to bring a bunch of different pieces of data or views into the VMM console. Another option is provisioning. So one of the ways that some people are looking at using add-ins is by, so for example, some hardware vendors have looked at this. If you have hardware that has some sort of firmware update that needs to be done on it before we do the operating system deployment or bring it under management in VMM, you could potentially have a workflow where there's a way for a user to open that information inside the VMM console, configure it, provision it, maybe download these firmware updates prior to kicking off the bringing it under management for VMM, and then continue with the rest of the workflow. Another way that you can use add-ins is for configuration. So for a lot of both hardware vendors or software vendors or even admins, there's a lot of little settings that for whatever reason you can't configure in VMM, right? There may be proprietary management software that somebody has that they want to be able to configure storage information kind of at a very deep level prior to bringing the storage under management. There might be some configuration for a DR solution or something that you can do prior to kicking that off. All of that is something that you could bring in as an add-in. And kind of the final option, this is common with storage vendors to think about this, is the notion of disaster recovery, right? So you might want to take a set of VMs or a host group or a cloud and say, right-click on that and say, put this under protection or recover this or something like that. But this isn't really just for partners. So I talk a lot about options for partners here, but add-ins can really work for administrators too, and it's really about linking different systems in your environment. So I talked to a guy at the booth on the expo floor who came up to me, and he was an admin for VMM, and he said, "We've written add-ins for everything," which was music to my ears. And what he was talking about was they have operators that sit in VMM, and he wants ways for them to be able to click buttons and kick off PowerShell scripts that he's provided them, orchestrator runbooks, things like that. And so he's written a bunch of different add-ins that wrap around these different tools that he knows his operators will need, and just imported them into the console for them. So it's really about bringing together kind of the best of both worlds, right? It takes data and actions in your systems where either you have a data center or you're a partner and you have management software, anything that can be accessed with APIs or scripts, right? And then it takes data and actions and objects in VMM. So we know about VMs, we know about clouds, we know about hosts, we know about storage, things like that. You can access all of that using our PowerShell commandlets. And it really brings them together in one spot. So if you're familiar with VMM, and I hope you are if you're in this session, you'll notice that this is not a, my laser pointer is not really showing up here. Oh, there we go. This on the right here is not a view you've ever seen before. And that's because it's an add-in that we've written. You can see there's a button up there that says enabled roles and features. And what it does is for each server you select on the left, it pulls up all the roles and features that are enabled on it. Pretty simple, not super complex, but useful. So if you're a Microsoft partner, really add-ins are about providing premium content or a premium experience for users of your product. And I'm going to talk to both partners and administrators in this audience, so forgive me a little bit if I flip back and forth between them. But as a partner, I really want for you to write add-ins for VMM. And you can write them, sell them, or distribute them for free. It's entirely up to you. You can brand them with your icons and content, so you can differentiate them from other competitors who are working in the area and from our console. And the source code stays private. So we don't ship the source code. I know like an ops manager with management packs a while ago, it used to be that you would ship the source code. That's not the case here. You ship it as DLLs. The one thing we do ask, if you're a Microsoft partner, is I'd really like for your add-in to fit in with the things around it. And what I mean by that is that if you have an experience where you need to collect a lot of data and then kick off a long-running task in the background, that you style that as a wizard, right? Because that's how we do it in VMM. If you have something where you want to configure a bunch of objects, but there's no sort of long-running task, it's just you're sort of adjusting settings, make that look like one of our property pages. And in general, sort of try to make the look and feel be similar to what you see in the console, so that it's not a jarring experience for your users and that they come into your add-in with the same sort of UI understanding that we have in our product. So there are two types of add-ins. Actually, before I go into this, one thing I meant to ask is, how many people here have heard of the add-ins for VMM before? Ah, good number, cool. And how many of you have actually written them? Yeah, partners, I see you. Cool, okay. So there are two types of add-ins, so this will be still new for most of you. There's short and simple, which are using XML. These are probably interesting for administrators. If you're a partner, you're probably not so interested in this type. And then there's much more elaborate, which is using code. And I'll talk about each of these in more detail. So using XML, the style of add-in is kind of like, essentially I think of it like a bookmark, right? It's a linked add-in. It opens a new window. You can open that window to an application or URL. It's simple to write because it's just an XML file. There's no code or anything like that. The caveat here is there's no context passed from VMM. It's a static link, and it always does the same thing. So these show up on the right side of the console. You can see here there's a little thing here that says Action Add-ins, and then they open new windows. So as an example, something that you can use these for is to link to like an incident management system. I would not recommend that you use a Elvis icon to do that unless you have a laid-back company, but that is an option. The other possibility is managed code. So these have two types of add-ins that are managed code. One is called Action Add-ins, and these use WPF code, and they'll open a new window that you render and control. So again, these look sort of similar to the XML add-ins, but they've got a lot more power to them. So again, you can see button over here on the right opens up this. This is a window that was created by the add-in. There's also view add-ins. So this is WPF code that controls the view on the right side of the console. And these have proven to be pretty popular. So what this does is it extends what we call our pivot views. And I don't know if pivot views are something that you've heard of, but there are these buttons that go underneath the show area here. And the reason why they're called pivot views is it's that you select something on the left over here, and then you sort of pivot around a different piece of information, right? So you have hosts, and then, ooh, yes, I do. Give me a second there. All right. My demos may be a little bit slower with that. All right, where was I? So you can pivot around different views, right? So you have hosts, and you want all the VMs that are on that host. You want all the services that are on a particular host here, right? So this is showing all the enabled roles and features that are on this particular host. And your WPF control paints this right side of the window. So there's different types. You want to use them for different things, obviously. So link add-ins are really about just opening to a new UI or another web page, or opening simple applications. Action add-ins, I don't know if you remember from 5 minutes ago when I talked about wizards and property pages. This is the sort of add-in that you'd want to create for that. If you want to collect a bunch of information and then kick off a long-running task, you probably want to do it as an action add-in, or if you want to sort of set some properties. And then view add-ins are for really about creating these types of views that don't exist in VMM today. So there are many different places that you can extend. The entry integration points are ribbon buttons and right-click menus. But from there, you can enter into all of these areas in the console. So you can tell add-ins, I want you to show up if there are hosts being displayed. I want you to show up if there are clouds being displayed, things like that. That's what these different contexts are. It's not the case that every place that exists in the console is extensible by add-ins. I'm sure you can dream up some spots that you would want to put an add-in that doesn't exist on this list. But this is what we have in this version. And there's some workarounds if you want to get into areas in the console that aren't listed here. This is documented online, so I'm not going to go through each detail, but mostly to show you that there are a lot of places you can get in. So one of the things that I've sort of mentioned off and on is this notion of context. So when we first started developing this, the questions that I most frequently got was, well, can I tell where I am in the VMM console as the add-in code? How do I know what the user's clicked? How do I know which workspace I'm in? And you can, and that list that I showed you earlier is both where you can have your add-ins displayed and the type of information we will pass you about what the user's doing in the console. So each time you move around in the console, we call a method that you'll write if you're using code. This is for code only. This is not XML. So anytime the user changes context, we will call your method and we will pass in the context for that area. And I'll talk more about what's included in that later. So to install and run add-ins, they're delivered as zip files, so that's pretty easy, nothing particularly fancy there. Each user installs the add-in on their own console. So it's very much like an IE add-in model, if you're familiar with that, right? You install it on your own console. If you go to another computer, you install it on that one as well. There's no programmatic or admin way to do it, so there's not sort of a centralized administrator experience. It's sort of everyone decides that they want it or they don't. If you're writing an add-in, one of the other questions that came up very early on was what the security model was like and what you had to do as an add-in author to manage security. So some important points are that the add-in runs as the user on the local machine. So if I, Johnnaby, have installed an add-in on my console, it runs as Johnnaby. It doesn't run on the server. It doesn't run as an administrator. It has only the authority of the things that I can do for issuing PowerShell and on my local machine items that you can do there. So some implications of this are that wherever you're going to have these add-ins installed on the console machines, they need to have access to whatever server you want that add-in to talk to. So if you have some management system someplace else and your users, you want to connect that in the VMM console, you may need to collect the user's credentials, you may need to direct them to make sure that firewalls are open appropriately, and you will need to handle that connection as part of the add-in code of opening it, passing credentials, et cetera. Specifically around managing authentication, it's often asked, do we have a way to manage authentication within VMM, or can we get it VMM run as accounts? The answer of all of this, for security reasons, is no. If you need to collect credentials, our suggestion is to use the Windows Credential Locker. I have a link to that at the end of the slides. And I should also mention, at the end of the slides, I actually have a bunch of bonus material, which I won't be covering today, but if you look at it afterwards, you can see the information there. So I have a link to the Windows Credential Locker, and you should use that. The other final thing is, if for some reason you have installed an add-in while you're developing and it isn't quite doing what you expected, like it's a runaway process or has somehow just taken over the console, which we try very hard to not let you do, but it is possible to just have like an infinite loop and sort of have things hang. You can start the console with no add-ins loaded. So that's how, if you get in that situation, you start it up, you remove the add-ins, and then you're good to go. So we have a couple partners that I'm going to demo. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Cisco. And they've written an add-in that manages UCS from within VMM. So if you're not familiar with UCS, it's a system that's a unified architecture for computing, network, storage, and virtualization. And the UCS manager is the management interface that sits on top of that. So their add-in allows you to manage UCS directly from VMM, and will correlate what we know about hypervisors with what they know about service profiles and physical servers and things like that. And they'll show a complete physical and logical inventory of their UCS environment. The other thing that it does is it'll show faults on a service profile for quick troubleshooting. And I'll show each of those. So this may take a moment here while I reconnect with some of my VPM stuff. Okay, so this is VMM console that you know and love. We have some hosts over here, and you'll notice that up here we have an add-in that's new. So this is the Cisco UCS add-in. If you're familiar with the UCS manager, this should look very common to you. The neat thing here is that they really rebuilt. This isn't just serving up the UCM manager. They actually rebuilt it to fit inside of VMM and look right. So there are a lot of different things you can do, right? You have the list of hypervisors here on the left. And then for each of those hypervisors, it'll show you all of the faults. You can associate and disassociate service profiles, so you can do some of the service profile management from here. You can open the KVM console, which is a personal favorite of mine, because if you need to do some sort of work on the computer that causes RDS to not work, you can actually connect to it. This will show up in the background in a moment. And while that's loading, I will show you, oh, there it is. Sometimes this one takes a moment. So see, can get directly to it. You can also get information about all of the firmware. So this is everything UCS knows about a particular blade. And then you can see faults for it. And as I said, these are live. So if you solve the problem, these faults will go away. You can also see over here on the left that there is both the logical, there's also the logical representation. Let me scroll down here. So you can see that all of the sort of organization structure that's stored in UCS is reproduced here. And you can see the different organizations like Cloud Infra and the different blades that belong to those. So I also want to talk about HP's add-in, because they've also done a great job creating an add-in that really brings together sort of the HP server view and has an emphasis on Virtual Connect. So their add-in shows physical and logical components of their system. And if you're not familiar with Virtual Connect, it's a networking technology that allows you to add, replace, and restore blades on the fly. Oh, yes, the wireless went down in here. We lost our remote connection here as well. Give me a second here. While I'm waiting for this, is a good time to also talk about NetApp. They've also created an add-in. I don't have a demo of it here today, but there are some of them in the audience here, as well as the HP and Cisco people. I'll have them come up at the end, so if you want to talk to them about it, they can. The NetApp add-in will show you, will allow you to clone VMs using their fast clone, and brings that inside of the VMM console. Also very cool. They've released it a while ago, as has Cisco and HP, and there's been a lot of interest in all of them. So it looks like my remote desktop is not behaving here. So let me swap back to the video. I apologize. I did not test the videos, sorry. There we go. Okay, so I'm not sure. Okay, so what this will show, although maybe not at quite the speed that I would do it to talk to, is that there's the HP add-in here, and there are multiple views that exist and a bunch of different actions that you can do. So you can launch some of the Virtual Connect viewers and data. You can also see the integrated lights on board, web console, and remote control. So there's here a couple of different things to look at. You'll notice that this shows the server information for this particular host. And then down below here lists all of the host VMs that are on the particular server. And then has information for each of it. And then in a moment here, it will open up and you can see some additional information about each one. So here it will show all the VM Ethernet adapters. There's the MAC address, logical network, VM networks, vSwitches. And then below this actually will show that it connects later, but below this is information about sort of specifically the host profile and fabric elements. So this is the lights on motherboard, NIC ports, and some more specific networking information. You'll notice here too that there's the option that if there are multiple IPs, you can pop that up and see all of them listed. also connects the logical network information. So this is the information that VMM knows about networks that's being pulled in to the HP piece. So these top and bottom views are actually connected, which is kind of interesting. And you'll notice that if you click there, the bottom view will scope to show the things that are related to this, so that these are both things that are on the corporate vSwitch. Which looks like we've got a screen sizing issue there. Trust me, it works. There we go. Okay, so at this point, and then if you re-click, it will just expand back out. The other thing that's really cool here is the fabric diagram. So this is a full picture of your diagram from the enclosure bays out to the port numbers. So this far left here is showing the enclosure, the host that's on it, the VMs that are related to it. Then it goes out to the right where you can see the FlexNICs. And from there, it'll show all the different connections, right? So these are the FlexNICs. And then you move to the right from there, and you can see the I/O bays. There's information that's more detailed for each of these that you can get by flying over. So again, like a very interactive add-in, right? You can write simple add-ins that just show information, or you can show ones that have a great deal of interaction in them. It's entirely your choice. And then over here on the right, we finally get to the uplink ports and how those are referred to in Virtual Connect. And then finally, on the far right, you can see the actual port numbers that they go out to the world in. So those are two of the partner add-ins that we have. So now I'm going to, wireless. Now I'm going to walk through two of the examples that we're creating, and hopefully my connections will stay up long enough that I can actually show you these, because I have some Visual Studio I want to pop open for you. And there are two add-ins. There's a simple add-in, which is going to be, of course, a Hello World add-in. And then there's a code add-in that will show you how to show the roles and features. This is the one I showed at the beginning. It's coded as a view add-in, will demonstrate the use of context, and it also demonstrates how you call commandlets from within an add-in. So let's talk through creating this one. This is the one you actually saw earlier. It's the Hello Las Vegas, slightly different than Hello World, and you can notice it's an add-in actions area. So XML add-ins have two major pieces to them. There's this top level, which is the console add-in, and this defines global information, like name, version, things that don't change. And then the second part of the XML defines what the add-in looks like, where it shows up, and how it behaves. So let's walk through a little bit more of the console add-in. So this top one, the XML namespace, this is just the schema name. This won't change at all in SP1. It's boilerplate. Just always have it look like this. The name, Hello Las Vegas, this is what shows up in the properties page. Version, we don't use the version for anything. This is merely showing up as properties. So you can put whatever number you want in here. We have no notion of version control. And I should mention sort of as part of this that if you have add-ins that you want to upgrade, the upgrade is essentially you want to install one add-in and install the next version. So it's pretty simple. Author name or company name. Again, if you are working for a large company, I would really recommend that you guys all use the same variant of this so that they all look the same. Some large companies will have different divisions that are creating add-ins. And then this is the folder where the add-in is stored. It's not super critical that whatever you put in here be meaningful. The user will very rarely see this, The main thing is, again, if you have a company where you have multiple different divisions producing add-ins, I would suggest that you use a similar folder name here just so that you're all in the same spot for tidiness. Then there's the second part of the XML. So again, this is saying that it's an action add-in, which is the type of add-in that opens new windows. This is this context I've been talking about. So this one is a kind of special one. It's called all home tabs. And what it means is that whenever you move around the console, up on the ribbon, there's a home tab. This will appear in all of those. And this is the way, if there's an area of the console that we haven't specifically given integration access to, that you can get your button to show up in there anyhow. This particular add-in is going to be a URL action add-in, but it could also be an application. One of the ones we wrote very early on here was a failover cluster manager launcher. So you could essentially look at a cluster, and you might want to launch failover cluster manager to do validation and see if there was something odd going on there. Icons are optional, but this one we definitely want one. The action param defines where we want the URL to go to. A key point here is for XML add-ins, this is static, so there's not string substitution. It really is like a bookmark. And then this is the button label that displays underneath. This is encoded add-ins, something that you can localize if you're really interested in producing localized add-ins, but is not for XML. So you deliver your finished add-in as the zip file I mentioned earlier, and it contains a couple of things. One is this manifest file. So I just walked through the simple XML add-in. That's also used for coded add-ins. It's what's called a manifest file. It must be called manifest.xml because we look for it to load and tell us where the add-ins are. And then you can optionally include icons and graphics or code. All right, let's see if we have our connectivity. Okay. All right, so this is the add-in that I just talked through. And you can see it's just a notebook file or notepad file with XML in it. So this is the import process. You click the import console add-in. You browse to where your zip file is. That green button that you saw there that said add-in is valid. Let me see if I can pause this for just a minute. So the green button that you saw that said the add-in is valid, what we do is we do sort of basic XML check as the add-in is loaded. So if something's wonky with your XML, we'll catch it there and tell you. And then at this point, you can see that the add-in is loaded on the far right and pops a URL. All right, so let's talk about building some more complex add-ins. So we're going to talk about creating the roles and features add-in. So that's, again, shown up here in the show. And it paints this entire screen here. So to begin this, you need to set up your own development environment. And you really want to install Visual Studio 2012 and the VMM console on the same computer. You can do them on different computers, but it's really a pain to get the references set up properly. And you can either use the documentation online to find all those required references, or we're going to be releasing, probably by the end of next week, the project template that we've created, which will preload all of these references for you, has example code in it, and just generally makes using these templates a lot easier. It makes creating an add-in much easier. So let me show you at this point what that looks like. So this is Visual Studio, and you can see that I'm creating a new project here. And if you go under Visual C#, and once you add this add-in, so it'll be something that will ship and then you install. It'll either be something we put on the blog or something that you can get through the gallery. We're still figuring out details about that. You can open, you'll see it appears kind of here under the Visual C#. And then it'll pop a window and it has you walk through creating information in here that's going to be used in your manifest file. So you'll notice this is all the stuff I just talked about in that simple XML file, right? There's an add-in name, there's a version. You can see here this display contexts, which is all the different places that you can appear in the VMM console. So it's a much easier way to create the manifest file than doing it from scratch. So you can select a couple of different contexts. This thing at the bottom here is the pointer to where your VMM console is installed because it's going to go get the references that it needs. So you can see here that it's been created and it has some C# code that's already included. So this has some of these methods that I'll talk about what these mean in a moment. We've documented them pretty well in the code so that you can look around and see what those different pieces are. It's also created the manifest file, as you can see. So this is what I just typed in, and this is auto-generated for you. And we also have just some information about how to use the template and getting started. And then this piece that I'm showing here is showing, that we have both an action add-in that pops a new window and an add-in that is a view add-in that takes over that right pane. So you'll be able to see examples for both. So there are really three parts to an add-in that's coded, particularly a view add-in. So there's the XAML file that defines the view. And I'm not going to talk a huge amount about this just because it's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. But that's what defines the view. There's what we call the code behind, which is the code that runs that UI in the XAML. And then there's actually the add-in code itself, which manages the connections between VMM and the code behind. So there's several methods to really know and love as part of this. So all add-ins have the methods that you'll want to implement of onload and on-unload. So what these are is when we first start the console, we load up your add-in. And the code that you put in on load is what we will run as part of that. So set up any connections you need, any sort of preset, maybe if you want to do some sort of caching of something, might be a reasonable thing to put there. And then on-unload is obviously what we do as we close the console. So again, close up any connections that you need. Any cleanup would go into there. For action add-ins, there's two additional methods that you can implement. So there's perform action. So this is the method we call when the user clicks the button that you've created. So that's kind of your main set of code of what you want to do. We also have one that's called check if enabled for. This is kind of a handy little method. The intent here is if you want to have your button be only, not grayed out, that's not quite the right word. If you have your button where you want it to be active for particular circumstances, you can use this method. So an example is if you're a hardware vendor and you want your button to only show up when your hardware is what the user has selected. So for example, if it's like a Dell server or an HP server or something like that, you can use this check if enabled for, and if you return true, we will show the button, and if you return false, we will gray it out. Then for view add-ins, there's an additional couple of methods to overwrite here. So one is create view control. So that does pretty much what it says. It creates the view control that we put on the right side. Set current scope is a really interesting one and one that you should become familiar with. So this is the one that we call every time the user clicks something different. So it's the way you essentially respond to the fact that the user has clicked a different server in the host view or has clicked a different tree node. We will call this and we will send you a context object that tells you what they did, and then you can write code to respond to that appropriately. On show and on hide, not to be confused with on load and on unload. These are what happens when you're moving around in the console and your view is displayed or hidden. So if you think about it, when you are looking at your host view, there's an option for like overview, right? So you can look at the overview view. Somebody might click that view. They might then click your add-in. We call on show at that point. They might be doing some things in your add-in, and they may want to go back to the overview page and look at some things. So they'll click the overview page again, and then we'll call on hide. So any sort of refreshing you need to do as we show and hide it is what goes in here. So I've talked a lot about context objects, but haven't really said exactly what they are. They are a lightweight object that's provided both when the add-in is called and then when users change scope, as I mentioned before. It contains everything in it that we think you might want to know as sort of a quick bit of information about what the user clicked. So for example, if a user clicks a VM, we will give you the VM name. We will give you the VM GUID. We will tell you the host that the VM is on. These are all things that we think you might need to do something with if somebody's using VMs. The thing that we won't give you, and that's kind of a key point here, is we don't give you the PowerShell object for any linked objects. So in the example of VM, right, I said we give name, we give GUID, we give host name. We do not give the host object. So if there's something that you need to know about the host that that VM is sitting on that isn't, it's more detailed, like you need to know hardware information about it, or you need to know the UUID or something like that, you'll need to issue a PowerShell call to VMM to get that additional information. And the reason for this is that sending these objects back and forth between the VMM and the add-in is a performance hit, right? And so we want to keep your add-in as quick and responsive as we can. And if we were to send this full linked object, your add-in would get very sluggish. All right, I'm going to try one more time with the VPN. I'm eternally an optimist. I have to say, though, this is better than a fire alarm in the middle of. Okay, so let me bring up Visual Studio here. And let's go through a little bit of the roles and features add-in. Okay, so let's start this. Make this a little bit bigger here. So this is the add-in code here. And you can see, right here, we're creating the view control. So this is what I talked about, where you actually create the view control and return it. This is probably the most interesting part in the entire piece of code. So this is that set current scope method that I talked about. So you can see up here at the top that we're getting a context. We're getting a context object. We know that it's a host context because we're told that that's the type it is. And then here, this is how you make PowerShell calls to other systems. So you can pretty much read this directly if you're familiar with PowerShell, right? This is, we're doing the get-wmi object. We're using the computer name that we got from the context object, and then we're adding it to our list. So that's the add-in code. And you can see, here's the XAML file. So it always takes the designer a moment to load. But this is, as it is in Visual Studio elsewhere. So if you want to work in the designer, you can do that directly. Or if you prefer to, sling XAML stuff directly, you could do that at the bottom. You can see here this isn't a particularly exciting view, right? We don't have a ton of different buttons and so forth. It's just a window that we're going to put text in. And then this is showing the code behind. So again, here you can see that we're creating the add-in control. And kind of the interesting part here, right, is that this shows the roles that are enabled and then adds them to an array and prints it. So not particularly difficult. If you're a developer or you have developers that work for you, they should be able to sling this out in under an hour. Sorry, wrong button there. And then here again, the importing the add-in, very simple. This will show you this add-in is valid but has warnings. You'll see this if you have not signed your code. So this example is not signed. It'll go away and turn into a nice green check once you have. But you can install it anyhow. We don't want to block you, particularly if you're developing stuff. You just have to say that you accept the risks of doing so. And then you can see here that we have the list of hosts, and we can show the enabled roles and features for it. And then you'll notice as we change here, it's a little bit subtle, but notice that roles enabled for computer name, it changes each time I click. So we're responding to the context that's being passed. So the other thing that you have to do, even for coded add-ins, is to create a manifest file for it. And this isn't vastly different than what we did before. This top part up here up at the top, I'm not going to talk about again, because it's the same as for the simple add-in. The main thing I want to point out here is that the view add-in is a little bit different. So it said action add-in before, it now says view add-in. And that you need to include the assembly name with a link to your assembly. One thing that frequently happens, I've done a lot myself, is if you mistype that even a little, since it's really long, of course it won't load, and it sometimes takes a while to figure out why, just because you think you've typed it correctly and it's non-intuitive that that's the problem. So again, packaging the same as before, manifest file, the DLL containing your code, any optional icons. The PDB file for debugging is interesting. So if you are developing add-ins, you can either use, if you're using the template we have, you can hit F5. It will build the add-in, the manifest file, and the zip file with everything in it. It will actually auto-import it into the VMM console for you. And if at that point you're running a debugger or have breakpoints, you can just see them running in Visual Studio. You can also, if you're not using the add-in, or not using the template, can use Visual Studio to attach a debugger in the normal way once you have the PDB file in the zip file. So there's a couple of tips and tricks about add-ins. So if you have a lot of information that you want to maintain and show the user and have them be able to interact with inside of a View add-in, I'd really recommend that you use tabs or pull-downs in the same way that the Cisco and the HP add-ins had, so you could see that you could switch between different views that way. So that'll give you sort of everything in the same area with additional screen real estate. Particularly if you're a partner, I would really encourage you to start with creating the smallest add-in that you think adds value for your customers and then build out from there. I've seen partners really try to tackle pulling together all of these different parts of System Center and wrapping them up in an add-in that talks to their thing and does some other stuff. And it's just a lot to undertake all at once. Add-ins are really easy to create, really easy to update. So start small, send it out for a beta, see what people say, and then iterate on that. There are also a couple of useful properties that you should know about. So current scope type tells you what the type is that the user's clicking, so whether you're getting hosts or VMs or things like that. User details is useful because it gives you information about the current user. So if you want to know what user role this VMM user is or what permissions they have, that will be inside that object. The other thing you can do is you can put multiple buttons and DLLs inside of one zip package and use the same manifest file. So some people want to have one button that does something for hosts and a different button in the VMs and services area. You can do that all in one zip file. You don't have to have your user install 8 different add-ins. The other thing I would say is try to avoid making VMM commandlet calls inside the setCurrentScope method. And the reason for this is that PowerShell calls are somewhat expensive, and it is very potentially a bad experience for your user, because if you're making sort of heavy PowerShell calls every time the user clicks something in the console, you will be giving them a very sluggish experience. So the sort of final tip I have is to use external jobs. And these are something that we created partway through the development cycle in response to partner feedback. Because some add-ins, right, a lot of the add-ins I've showed you have been about displaying information and bringing information into the console. But you can also spin off a background thread and have it go do a large amount of work. And the question is, if you're doing something like that, how does your add-in user know whether that work is complete or partially done or hung or something like that? And so what you can do is you can essentially tell VMM to create jobs on your add-in behalf and then update them with progress. So let me show you what this looks like. So I'm going to go to the jobs view. I'm going to look at the running jobs. And you'll notice that I have an add-in up here that just says start a job. And all this add-in does is it starts, it sleeps for some time, and it sends some progress, and it sleeps some more time, and it sends some more progress, and so forth. So you can see here, right, this is the add-in saying I'm 30% done, I'm 40% done, et cetera. And when it eventually completes, it completes with a message. So you can go to the history and you can say, ah, yes, like this is informational. So if you have some sort of problem, you can complete the job and then put information in here. You can also fail jobs. So this is just done via PowerShell. So you have this new SC external job. You give it a name. And then you probably want to grab the object that comes back from it so that when you set SC job, you can use that object and then change the progress value. So pretty simple. There's a lot of different resources available for this. So there's add-in documentation that's on MSDN that has, as part of it, all the methods I talked about, all the context objects, lists of all those integration points, so you don't have to memorize all that. There's also a link here to the Windows Credential Management Overview, as I mentioned. That's a spot that you can find how to authenticate and manage credentials without writing this on your own. Codeplex has a downloadable code example that we've put up. And particularly for admins, if you write other add-ins that you think would be useful, we would love for you to add them here and tag them with VMM and add-ins. It would be just really exciting for me if we could get some sort of community going of useful add-ins for people on Codeplex. Finally, I got to give props to my band. So the three of us built this feature that we talked about today. We're not a huge feature team. So David Wilson's my developer and wrote this for developer, which I think is really good since that's the area that we're targeting. And then Ben Davidson is my tester who hopefully flushed out all of the bugs in this before you find them. Since there are so few of us and we love to hear from people about how it's going, if you make one of these, just drop us a line. This is a DLL that just has the three of us on it, and we would love to hear about it. If you have questions, you can write there too, but even if you just were successful, tell us. And then we're part of a larger virtual machine manager team. I think you've seen this slide if you were in Vijay Tiwari's. So this is our whole group on a very sunny Redmond day, which comes once in a lifetime. Most of these related sessions have already occurred, but if you're watching the video, check these out. Some of them are very useful and provide additional information about VMM. And this is my first time speaking at MMS, so feedback is very helpful. I would love to hear it. At this point, if you have questions, please feel free to, I don't know that there are so many of you that we need to have the mics, but feel free to ask. And also, if the partners could come up, NetApp, you too, then if you have questions, we can kind of direct you to the right person if you're interested in getting copies of those add-ins. So thanks.